The line stretched around the block, a restless coil of nerves, ambition, and fading hope. Some clutched guitars, others whispered warm-up scales under their breath, and a few stood silently, eyes closed, rehearsing a moment they had dreamed about for years. Among them was a girl who carried nothing but a small, worn backpack and a heart too big for her fragile frame. Her name was Lyra. No one noticed her at first. Why would they? She wore simple clothes, an oversized gray sweater, slightly frayed at the cuffs, and a pair of old sneakers that had clearly seen too many rainy days. Her long black hair was tied back loosely, strands escaping to frame a face that held both youth and quiet resilience. In her hands, she clutched a folded piece of paper, her audition number. She didn't bring an instrument. That alone drew a few glances. In a line filled with polished cases and shining equipment, she looked unprepared. A boy behind her smirked, whispering to his friend, "Maybe she forgot what audition this is." Lyra heard it. She heard all of it. But she didn't respond, because she had learned a long time ago that sometimes silence was stronger than words. Thousands of miles away from the bright lights and towering stage she now stood before, Lyra had grown up in a narrow alley in a crowded district of Manila. The houses there leaned into each other like tired friends, patched together with scrap wood and rusted tin roofs that rattled violently during storms. Her family had very little. Her father worked long hours as a tricycle driver, often returning home with barely enough to cover food for the next day. Her mother took in laundry, her hands constantly raw from soap and water, her back bent from years of labor. And yet, despite the hardships, their home was filled with something rare, warmth. But warmth didn't pay bills. When Lyra was 8, her father fell ill. What started as a cough turned into something more serious, something they couldn't afford to properly treat. The little money they had went into medication that barely helped. Lyra remembered the day everything changed. It was raining heavily, the kind that turned the narrow alley into a river of muddy water. She sat by the doorway, hugging her knees, listening to the soft groans coming from inside. Her mother was crying quietly. That night, Lyra made a promise to herself. She would find a way out. Music found her before she found it. Across the street from their home lived an old man everyone called Lolo Ben. He was a quiet figure, rarely seen outside except to sweep the small area in front of his house. What most people didn't know was that inside that house sat an old, slightly out-of-tune piano. One afternoon, drawn by curiosity, Lyra peeked through his open window. Her eyes widened. She had never seen anything like it up close. The piano keys, though yellowed with age, looked magical to her. When Lolo Ben noticed her, she quickly tried to run away, but his gentle voice stopped her. "Do you want to try?" She hesitated. "I don't know how," she admitted. He smiled. "That's how everyone starts." That was the beginning. Every day after finishing her chores, Lyra would sit beside the old piano, her small fingers pressing keys with cautious wonder. Lolo Ben didn't teach her with strict lessons. Instead, he encouraged her to listen, to the rhythm of rain, the hum of distant traffic, the quiet sighs of the evening breeze. "Music is everywhere," he would say. "You just have to feel it." And she did. Within months, Lyra began to play simple melodies. Within a year, she was creating her own. It became her escape. When the world felt too heavy, when hunger gnawed at her stomach, when the future seemed like a locked door with no key, she turned to the piano. There, she was, free. But life doesn't wait for dreams to grow. At 13, Lyra had to stop visiting Lolo Ben regularly. Her mother needed help, and school expenses were becoming harder to manage. She started working small jobs, running errands, helping vendors, anything that could bring in a little extra money. The piano became a memory she carried rather than a place she could visit. Then one day, she returned. The door was closed. A neighbor told her Lolo Ben had passed away. Lyra stood there for a long time, staring at the silent house. It felt like a piece of her had been taken away. But a week later, something unexpected happened. A man approached her while she was helping her mother with laundry. He introduced himself as Lolo Ben's nephew. "You're Lyra, right?" he asked. She nodded. "My uncle talked about you," he said, smiling gently. "He wanted you to have something." He handed her a small, folded note. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, in slightly shaky handwriting, were the words. Music chose you for a reason. Don't let it go. Tears blurred her vision. That day, Lyra made another promise. No matter what happened, she would keep playing, even if only in her heart. Years passed. Lyra grew older, stronger, but life remained a constant struggle. Her father never fully recovered, and the responsibility on her shoulders only grew heavier. Dreams felt like luxuries she couldn't afford, until one evening changed everything. She was walking home after a long day when she passed by a small electronics shop. A crowd had gathered around the display window. Curious, she stepped closer. On the screen was a talent show, bright lights, cheering audiences, and performers pouring their hearts into music. Lyra watched, captivated. For a moment, the noise of the world faded. All she could see was the stage. All she could feel was the music. That night, she couldn't sleep. The image of that stage burned in her mind. What if? She whispered to herself. The thought was terrifying, but it was also alive. It took months of saving, planning, and silent determination. Lyra worked extra hours, skipping meals when necessary, until she finally had enough money for a one-way trip to the city where auditions were being held. She didn't tell many people. Dreams, she had learned, were fragile things. Not everyone handled them with care. When she finally arrived, the city felt overwhelming. The buildings were taller, the streets louder, the pace faster than anything she had ever known. And yet, she walked forward. Because she had come too far to turn back. Now, standing in that long line, Lyra felt the weight of everything she had been through pressing against her chest. Fear whispered to her, "You don't belong here." She tightened her grip on her audition number. Then another voice rose, quieter but stronger. "You've already made it this far." Hours passed. Finally, her number was called. Her legs felt like they might give out as she walked toward the stage. The bright lights blinded her for a moment, and the massive audience seemed like a sea of unfamiliar faces. At the judges' table, a panel watched her with polite curiosity. "Hello," one of them said. "What's your name?" "Lyra," she replied softly. "And what will you be performing today?" She hesitated. "I'll be playing the piano." There was a pause. "You didn't bring one," another judge noted. "There's one on stage," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. A few raised eyebrows. "All right," the first judge said, gesturing. "Let's see what you've got." The piano sat at the center of the stage, gleaming under the lights. Lyra approached it slowly. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the keys. Memories flooded back. Lolo Ben's gentle voice, the small room, the feeling of her fingers discovering music for the first time. She took a deep breath. Then she sat down. Her hands hovered above the keys. The world fell silent. And then, she played. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like a whisper. But they carried something deeper, something raw and real. As her fingers moved, the music began to grow. It wasn't just a melody, it was a story. Her story. The struggles, the pain, the hope she had refused to let die. Each note felt like a piece of her soul being laid bare. The audience leaned forward. The judges exchanged glances. This was different. This wasn't just skill. This was truth. As the music swelled, Lyra closed her eyes. She wasn't on that stage anymore. She was back in that small room, sitting beside an old piano, with someone who had believed in her before she even believed in herself. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Because this moment, this was everything. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. For a heartbeat, no one moved. And then, the room erupted. Applause thundered through the hall, rising to a standing ovation. Lyra opened her eyes, stunned. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anything. The judges were on their feet. One of them wiped away a tear. "That," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "was one of the most honest performances we've ever seen." Another leaned forward. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Lyra swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "From someone who believed in me." The moment was captured, recorded, and shared. Within hours, it began to spread. Within days, it went viral. People from all over the world watched the video of a girl who had nothing but talent, and gave everything she had on that stage. They shared it, commented on it, connected with it. Because in her music, they saw something universal. The courage to dream. Back home, in that narrow alley, neighbors gathered around small screens, watching with disbelief and pride. Her mother cried. Her father smiled for the first time in a long while. And somewhere, in the quiet memory of a small room with an old piano, a promise had been kept. Lyra stood on a new stage days later, the world suddenly watching her. But this time, she wasn't afraid. Because she knew something now. She had never really been alone. Music had been with her all along. And as her fingers touched the keys once more, she smiled. Not because she had made it, but because she had finally found her way.